Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartiya, and welcome to another episode of TFR Let's Talk. And today we have with us Alex Gallego, founder and CEO at Redpanda. Alex, it's great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, since you are founder of the company itself, so I would love to know a bit about the story and history of the company, why you started, what problem you saw that you wanted to solve.
I guess, by means of introduction, I've been doing streaming for 13 years now. Prior to this, I built an equivalent of an Apache Flink in C++ on top of Mesos. So it was really built for low latency stuff. We sold that company to Akamai in 2016. It sort of powers some pretty important use cases there. When I was there, I really couldn't find a storage engine that could keep up with the volumes of data I was trying to build. And so I tested the hardware and I wanted to understand the gap between hardware and state-of-the-art software. What came out of that was really Redpanda. And the way to think about it is that for a lot of the storage engines, they were really designed for a decade-old bottleneck in computing, which was the clock tick of the spinning disk. If you fast forward a decade later, that new bottleneck for a storage engine shifted from the clock tick of the spinning disk to CPU coordination problems. And sometimes, you're lucky enough that you get to reinvent the wheel when the road changes. And so we really started Redpanda as a way to build a Kafka replacement for mission critical systems.
You have been in this ecosystem market for over 13 years, and streaming data has also been around for quite some time. You're also at a Kafka event at this point. How much adoption you are seeing there, and are you happy with this? Hey, you know what, the folks who were meant, because streaming data is not for, I mean, people will argue that it is for everybody, but maybe not for everybody. But you feel that, hey, you know what, whoever was meant to adopt, embrace it, they have already adopted it, or you feel that there is still a big gap? And if you feel that there's gap, what is holding them back? So let's look at the both, how comfortable you feel with the adoption and where you feel there is still, more need.
So, two things. As someone that's been a streamer for a long time, I feel that this wasn't the case with my previous startup, but we finally hit escape velocity in the market where streaming is actually sort of front and center into how people want to run their businesses. And I think what's changed from an end user perspective, and I'll dig into the technical and adoption and just the technicalities you mentioned, but from an end user perspective, we as users started to demand real-time experiences, whether it was Uber Eats when my wife was pregnant. She's like, where's my food? And I could show her the app. I was like, it's 5 minutes from the door. It'll be here in 5 minutes. So those experiences transitively, right? But there's no magic, right? So at some point, it has to run on a thing that looks like a Redpanda, and that's really what's changed. Is that there's basically this now finally there's this escape velocity where streaming has hit mainstream, and businesses are moving from batch to real time. Now that's the underlying current of the market. I think with Kafka and Redpanda, sort of the adoption that we've seen is that we have this, super successful brownfield migrations like Akamai. They had 10 years of code that they had written against Kafka. They pointed it at Redpanda and it just worked. There was no migration story, there's no hero story, it simply just worked. So for us, it was really critical to build a new storage engine for the modern hardware from the ground up in C++, but it spoke the same language. That was really kind of a critical thing for us. So that's allowed us to sort of observe and get sort of adopt the classical migrations. You mentioned something really important, which was, is this still, for everyone, or like who are the users of real time? So anyone that needs fast data could really benefit from a streaming system. It's simply a new way of thinking about your architecture. You can think of it as a new paradigm. And really what I think about Redpanda did, like the true market innovation, we are faster, sure, we're written in C++, we reduce the complexity from 4 systems down to 1. Those are great things and people do care about that. But for the newcomers, what they care about is the developer experience. Actually, the last mile is the human experience trying to build the real-time applications. And frankly, they don't care if it's called, Redpanda or Kafka or Foo or But. What they're interested in is they're interested in solving a business problem. And what we did for them is we made the experience of getting up and running in a real-time system so easy to use that we're now seen as sort of the de facto way of starting new applications.
So I want to go a bit deeper into that area, that when and what kind of applications they best leverage, streaming data. And also, if you can share some, you drop the word Uber at some point. If you can also share some use cases, it could either be Redpanda use cases, or in general, these are the industries, these are the use cases that can better leverage streaming data.
Yeah, and actually, I'll give you two things, which is where the industry is and where it's heading. Because what we're seeing is we're in this really interesting market sort of intersection where we enable new use cases. And so classically, let's talk just about Redpanda customers. So we're used for space exploration, where they there's like not one but two companies that they put a satellite in a rocket, they ship the rocket to outer space, and the thing that is powering that's like the rocket orbiting Earth, part of that is powered by Redpanda. We're seeing Redpanda being used in intelligent beds in the United States, where like working with vendors where or another a client company where as soon as you walk into the emergency room, all of the monitoring systems will be eventually powered by a Redpanda. We're seeing it with some of our use cases. Hedge funds are trading billions of dollars through Redpanda, and so what happens is all of these systems have a component where you have this huge back pressure of these like tiny events, and you need to make sense of them. And the fundamental shift that we see, whether it's both for analytical or for these operational use cases, is that sort of it's the idea of how do I extract value out of now, like as the data is flowing through my network, and that latency opens up new use cases like trading is a good example, algorithmic trading, fraud detection, oil and gas pipeline jitter between the US and Canada. We're seeing use cases with that. We're seeing Redpanda being embedded in the actual payment provider because we're so efficient. So what Kafka did classically on a lot of the stream processing is that it was really used for analytical use cases. So an example is you would have a web server, it would hit some HTTP endpoint, and then some process would come back and pick that data and put it in a database, and you would write reports. The shift that we're seeing now for most sort of forward-leaning, streaming technology companies is that they're also using it for the operational use cases, like I mentioned, trading, fraud detection, oil and gas pipeline jitter, space exploration, electric car vehicle telemetry, and so on. Does that give you a sense kind of where we fit in the market?
Oh yeah, I mean, you fit all the way from ground level to all the way to space, and maybe even Mars at some point.
Yeah, exactly. It's the closest thing. When I was a kid, I always wanted to go to space. It's like, it's probably the closest thing that I'll ever have when
You may not be there, but your code is there. So
yeah,
it's the same thing, right?
totally very unexpected, and just very happy about that.
Right. Can you also talk about, once again, we touched upon this earlier. I want to once again go back to the same point. We're talking about the adoption that you're seeing. There is still, you see there is still a scope for more adoption, more awareness. Talk about that segment also, where you see that, hey, these folks should be adopting, where you feel that maybe education is needed, maybe they don't have the tools, maybe they don't have, the whole, we're looking at DevOps mindset also to embrace that. So talk about that part.
For historical reasons, and really in the big data world, it has been largely driven by Java and systems, right? And the JVM has been notoriously difficult to tune and optimize, and anyone that has run large code bases understands that. Now, what happened is that there were a lot of really fantastic projects that we even got to learn from, like Kafka and Zookeeper were good projects that we got to learn from. And really, for us to exist, that these other projects had to exist, because we couldn't have advanced the state of the art without being inspired by the systems that came before us. And now, the way to think about that, and where the bottleneck is for a lot of adoption, is that these systems are notoriously difficult to run and optimize. So the hello world to a practitioner honestly feels like distributed system whack-a-mole. It's just like, it's like which door, which Jumanji door am I going to open up in the closet today? And it's very difficult to understand. And so what do people do? They honestly do the simplest possible thing that could possibly work, which is to do real-time streaming. They'll put it on an in-memory queue, they'll have a Python cron job, and then, that'll be it until you fail and you lose data and people will start to come up with more complexity. Now, that's the real window of opportunity right now. The window that we see that we're trying to target is like, how do we make it super, super easy to use? And it's shown, right? So we've really built the tech for 2 years now. We've been in market for a year and a half trying to make money on the company and product. And we've seen hundreds of thousands of people actually install clusters every month. And it's mind-blowing because it's such a short period of time. Now, what it's missing, and I think to continue that opportunity, is that while Redpanda has made this huge stride and made things super simple, right? just to give you a concept, to deploy Redpanda, you need one file, and you put it on 1, 2, 3 computers, and you're done. That's it. So like trivial, right? But now what needs to happen is that we need to continue to expand on that. And Kafka and these other systems were designed in the era of data center with low latency, high bandwidth links. And that's just not where the world is heading, right? The world is heading where you sign up and you do like a React application and you deploy it to some of the serverless provider and it basically just runs. That's where streaming needs to meet the developer today. And I really think that that's the main gap. The main gap is not on the technology because we've proven that we can saturate hardware. The next gap for us is like, how do we meet the developer where they are? How do we adapt to the ways that they're thinking? Forward looking, there will always be more real-time applications written in the future than there have been in the past. So I think that as a company, that's really where I see the future of us and really of the streaming market in general.
Can you also talk a bit about, if you have not necessarily a whole playbook, but some tips, some best practices that, organizations, folks, companies can, kind of adopt when they embrace, streaming real-time data. At the same time, they should also be aware of some limitations that are there, hard limits that they can hit, and so a lot of, missteps that people make, mistakes that made, so they can, kind of avoid them. So please share your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so when people get started, they'll bring up an initial system and they'll start doing real-time streaming. Maybe they'll connect an application or a database or a machine learning framework, and that'll work just fine. As you start to scale, you'll start to hit on some fundamental limits of some technologies today. The first one, just to get the cat out of the bag, is cost. In streaming infrastructure, historically has had a tendency to be extremely expensive. And the reason is that when streaming was invented, it was invented with local disk in a data center sort of application. And then the cloud came about. And now you have this extremely scalable, high bandwidth storage system like S3 or GCS or Azure Blob Store. And so to actually make a fundamental change in enterprises, what we had to do is we had to integrate natively into this high bandwidth storage systems like S3, which is super cheap to store a large amount of data. Now, the reason I bring out as a fundamental difference historically and now is because as a developer, it frees up your mind from having to think a priori of all of these downstream systems that you connect to. Today's, ClickHouse, and tomorrow's MongoDB, and the next day is whatever it is. And so as an architect, when I'm building a system, I want to have the freedom to not think of the totality of systems that I need to think of for downstream. So tiered storage was really sort of the next limit that we solve, and we're seeing a lot of vendors actually heading in this direction as well. And we know a couple of them also have it. And so that sort of was the next foundation. First, it was the compatibility with the ecosystem, but next was the tiered storage. And that evolution of making it cost effective is, I think, sort of the biggest hurdle that some enterprises are having now, and which is it's a good time to be in, sort of in the streaming tech.
Alex, thank you so much for taking time out today and not only share the story of Redpanda, also that how you're also not only on the ground but also in the space. I wish you will be in the space also one day. Maybe you will have your own office on Mars as well. We'll see that how far Elon Musk goes. But I really appreciate not only the story but also some of the insights, some of the tips that you also shared in terms of streaming data. And I would love to have you back on the show. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it. Take care.